Western medicine did not discover plant-based healing. It arrived late, looked around, and started renaming things it found already there. For more than 2,000 years, Chinese physicians maintained a working pharmacopoeia, hundreds of plants documented, tested across generations, and prescribed with a clinical precision that modern research is only beginning to catch up to. And what nobody talks about is this: the discoveries being made in Western laboratories right now are not new. They are confirmations. Scientists are not finding what works. They are finding out why things that already worked. Number 14. On this list, the white peony root sits at the center of a 4-herb formula that has been in continuous clinical use for approximately 1,300 years. Not remembered fondly. Not occasionally revived. Continuously prescribed by generation after generation of practitioners. And number 11, the Chinese gold thread contains a compound called berberine that is performed alongside metformin in peer-reviewed Western diabetes trials. The plant looks like something you would step over in a woodland garden without a second thought. If you grow your own food, if you have always suspected that older knowledge systems understood things modern culture has forgotten, and if you want to know what serious researchers are now quietly confirming, subscribe to this channel. We cover this kind of territory every single week. Here are 15 plants that Chinese doctors relied on for 2,000 years and what Western science is finally saying about them. Number 1. Red sage, the heart herb that predates the stethoscope. Salvia miltiorrhiza, Danshen. By the time of the Han Dynasty, around 200 AD, Chinese physicians had already been prescribing this plant's deep crimson roots for heart conditions, poor circulation, and what we would now call angina. The Shenlong Bencao Jing, the oldest surviving Chinese pharmacopoeia, lists it among the superior herbs, the ones considered safe to use long-term without harm. What traditional doctors understood was that this plant moved stagnant blood. In practical terms, they used it when patients experienced chest pain, palpitations, and numbness in the limb, symptoms we now associate directly with cardiovascular disease. Western cardiologists are now conducting formal clinical trials. The plant's key compounds, tanchinones and salvionolic acids, have shown measurable effects on LDL cholesterol reduction, blood pressure regulation, and neuroprotection following stroke. A 2024 cultivation study at Mississippi State University confirmed that Danshen grows commercially viable in American soil. Planted in a deep raised bed, it develops a thick taproot that rewards the depth. Full sun to partial shade, well-draining soil, zones 5 through 9. It produces tall violet flower spikes that make it genuinely beautiful as well as useful. Once established, it handles drought without complaint. This plant faded from Western awareness simply because it was never part of Western awareness. The European herbal tradition had its own sage, culinary sage, and the assumption that sage meant one thing closed the door on its Chinese medicinal cousin for centuries. A plant that kept hearts functioning in China while Europe was still bleeding patients with leeches is worth a second look. Number 2. The living fossil, a tree with no living relatives on Earth. Eucommia ulmoides, Zhong. This tree is the only surviving member of an entire plant family. Its closest relatives are in the fossil record. When you tear a leaf or pull bark from a young branch, fine elastic threads appear between the layers, natural latex-like strands, composed of trans-polyisoprene, chemically similar to rubber. No other broadleaf tree on Earth does this. Chinese physicians use the bark to strengthen bones, support kidney function, and lower blood pressure. The classic formula incorporating Zhong appeared in the Jingui Yao Lu, a clinical text from the 3rd century that modern TCM practitioners still consult today. Over 112 bioactive compounds have been isolated from this tree. Western research confirms measurable anti-hypertensive effects from its lignans and iridoids, along with bone density improvements that researchers are actively exploring for osteoporosis applications. The leaf tea is consumed daily by millions across East Asia, not as medicine, but as an everyday beverage. Planted in full sun in any reasonable soil, it is one of the most cold-hardy medicinal trees from Asia, thriving in zones 4 through 8. It grows large over decades, but responds well to managed pruning. Propagate from seed or summer cuttings. It faded from Western horticultural awareness because its value was invisible to colonial-era botanists who cataloged it as ornamental, and moved on. The bark was not a flower. The bark did not interest them. A tree that has outlasted every medical system that ever dismissed it is still standing, and now it has company in Western cardiology and bone density research. Number 3. The 5-flavor berry. What the Silk Road carried before coffee. Schisandra chinensis. Wei Zi. Chinese classical texts describe this berry as containing all 5 elements in a single fruit: sweet, sour, salty, bitter, and pungent. That is not poetry, it is pharmacology. The 5 distinct compound groups creating those 5 tastes act on 5 different physiological systems simultaneously, which is why imperial physicians considered it among the most complete tonics in the entire materia medica. It was traded along the Silk Road. Soviet sports scientists discovered it independently during the Cold War and quietly incorporated Schisandra extracts into classified athletic enhancement protocols, research that only became public knowledge decades after those programs ended. Western sports science is now confirming what those Soviet researchers documented. Schisandra prevents lactic acid accumulation in muscle tissue during exercise, which extends physical endurance, a mechanism replicated in multiple controlled trials. European studies have confirmed its hepatoprotective properties, meaning it actively shields liver tissue from oxidative damage. Grow it as a twining vine, it needs a trellis and reaches 20 to 25 feet. You need both a male and female plant to produce fruit. Rich, moist soil in zones 4 through 8. The berries ripen in late summer into dramatic scarlet clusters that would earn this vine a place in any ornamental garden, regardless of its medicinal value. The plant was unknown in Western horticulture because its native range, northeastern China and parts of Russia, did not export seed into European gardening networks during the centuries when plant knowledge was being collected and catalogued. One vine on your fence line carries more practical information inside its berries than most people who grow them ever discover. Number 4. The common man's answer to the emperor's herb. Codonopsis pilosula. Danshen. True Panax ginseng was an imperial commodity. Its harvest was controlled, its price was extraordinary, and rural physicians across most of China simply could not obtain it for their patients. So they used Codonopsis instead, a climbing vine with purple speckled bell flowers and a fleshy taproot that smells, when dried, almost indistinguishably like genuine ginseng. Traditional physicians understood that Danshen tonified what TCM calls qi in the lungs, and spleen, the vital energy governing immunity, digestion, and stamina. In practical terms, they prescribed it for fatigue, digestive weakness, and the kind of low-grade immune vulnerability that precedes seasonal illness. Modern pharmacology has confirmed that Codonopsis increases red blood cell counts, enhances immune response, and modulates gut microbiota in ways that parallel Panax ginseng's documented effects. It is also edible. Roots are cooked directly into soups and stews throughout rural China and have been for centuries. Grow it as a climbing vine, 6 to 10 feet tall, in well-drained loamy soil, zones 5 through 9, full sun to partial shade. Roots are harvestable in 2 to 3 years, far less demanding than the years of careful cultivation that Panax ginseng requires. It grows easily from seed and performs well in containers. This plant faded from Western awareness because the global supplement industry built its marketing around Panax ginseng, which carries more commercial name recognition and commands a higher price. What common people actually used was never made into a premium product. Something that the farmers of 2,000 years ago could reliably grow and use is still available to you today at a fraction of the cost of what their emperors were paying. Number 5. The ginseng that stops bleeding. Panax notoginseng, Sanqi. Chinese military physicians in the Han Dynasty packed this root's powder directly into battlefield wounds to stop hemorrhaging. What observers documented was speed, a rate of clotting that was considered extraordinary. Sanqi is a cousin of Panax ginseng, not the same plant, and many traditional scholars placed it above common ginseng in practical clinical value. What traditional physicians understood was a pharmacological paradox. This root simultaneously stopped bleeding and improved circulation. These two effects were understood as aspects of the same underlying action on the blood system. Western medicine has historically treated these as opposing mechanisms. Western cardiologists are now specifically investigating this paradox. Sankey's saponin compounds appear to act on both platelet aggregation and vascular dilation pathways through separate chemical mechanisms. It is showing results in stroke recovery trials and post-surgical healing protocols in multiple Asian clinical studies. Grow it in dappled shade with rich, humus-heavy, well-draining soil. A low perennial, 1 to 2 feet sensitive to direct afternoon sun. Zones 9 through 11 outdoors, but manageable in containers indoors, in cooler climates. Roots are ready in 3 years and require that patience. This plant's invisibility in Western gardens comes from its demanding climate requirements and its association with a traditional system that Western medicine spent most of the 20th century dismissing as unverifiable. The powder that Han Dynasty battlefield surgeons carried is the subject of active cardiology research in European and North American institutions right now. Number 6. The famine food that Taoists called immortal, Polygonatum sibiricum, Huangjing. Taoist hermits reportedly fasted for weeks on nothing but this root, believing it could sustain a person indefinitely. That specific claim belongs to mythology. But the underlying observation that this rhizome contains something nutritionally and medicinally significant does not. Chinese physicians used it as a supreme yin tonic, prescribed for fatigue, dry coughs, and the kind of chronic thirst and blood sugar instability that we now recognize as early-stage metabolic dysfunction. During historical famines, the dried and ground rhizome was mixed with flour to extend food supplies. This plant has literally kept populations alive. Western research has identified polysaccharides in the rhizome with near-identical structural properties to those found in ginseng and astragalus. Its alpha-glucosidase inhibiting effect, essentially slowing sugar absorption from meals, is now being studied for type 2 diabetes management. Anti-inflammatory and anti-acetylcholinesterase properties relevant to Alzheimer's disease research have also been documented in current studies. Planted in shade, it prefers woodland conditions with moist, humus-rich soil. It grows 2 to 4 feet tall with arching stems and small white bell flowers, hardy in zones 3 through 9. The rhizome multiplies steadily each year, can be harvested and cooked, and makes a natural fit for the understory of any food forest. It disappeared from Western horticultural consideration because it has no European analog and was never absorbed into the Mediterranean and Northern European herbal tradition that shaped most of what the West calls herbalism. What kept famine survivors alive in the Tang Dynasty can be growing quietly in the shade of your fruit trees, and nobody in your neighborhood will know what it is. Number 7. The yellow root that drug-resistant bacteria cannot ignore. Scutellaria bioactive, Huangqin. This is not the blue skullcap found in Western herb shops. That is a different species, a different continent, and a different chemistry. Chinese skullcap Scutellaria baicalensis has a thick yellow taproot and a medicinal flavonoid called baicalene that is currently generating more Western research interest than almost any other plant compound in this category. Traditional physicians prescribed Huangqin for fevers, infections, respiratory conditions, and inflammatory disorders. The root's intense yellow color was understood as a marker of its potency, similar to how golden-rooted plants across multiple traditional cultures developed the same intuitive recognition of these compounds long before chemistry existed to explain it. A 2024 University of Florida study screening 132 TCM plant species for antimicrobial activity placed Scutellaria baicalensis among the top performers against SCP pathogens, the group of drug-resistant organisms that the World Health Organization has designated as critical threats to global public health. Baicalene was also identified in early 2020 laboratory research as potentially inhibiting a specific viral replication mechanism now under formal investigation. Planted in full sun with well-draining sandy or loamy soil, it does not tolerate standing water. It grows 1 to 2 feet tall with small blue-purple flowers and handles drought well once established. Zones 5 through 9 sow seed directly in spring. The root reaches peak medicinal compound concentration around year 3. This plant faded from Western pharmacological attention because pharmaceutical culture prioritized synthesizable single-compound drugs and had no economic interest in investigating plant matrices whose active components could not be isolated and owned. A root that outperforms pharmaceutical antibiotics against organisms that standard treatments can no longer reach is the kind of thing worth making room for in your garden. Number 8. The winter tree that blooms first. Cornus officinalis. Shen. Before we continue, if this kind of research-backed, history-grounded plant knowledge is exactly what you come to this channel for, hit the like button right now. It tells us this content is worth continuing to produce, and it helps other gardeners who are looking for exactly this find their way here. And I have a genuine question for you in the comments. Which of the plants we have covered so far surprises you most? Not which is most useful, but which genuinely caught you off guard. The answers are always more specific and more interesting than I expect. Now, back to the list. This small ornamental tree erupts in golden yellow flowers before a single leaf appears sometimes in February, making it one of the earliest visible signs of life in a winter garden. Those flowers give way to clusters of deep red berries, tart like a sour cherry, that Chinese physicians harvested for 2,000 years to treat kidney weakness, excessive urination, and dizziness symptoms we now associate with adrenal and hormonal dysregulation. The Shenong Bencao Jing, China's first systematic pharmacopoeia, lists Cornus officinalis as a core yin tonifying herb. Its iridoid compounds have now been confirmed in Western research to carry genuine anti-diabetic, antioxidant, and neuroprotective properties. The University of Bristol's Botanic Garden maintains living specimens specifically for ongoing medicinal research. Grow it in full sun to partial shade, with rich, moist, well-draining soil. It reaches 15 to 25 feet, zones 5 through 8. Purchase grafted nursery plants for earlier fruiting, or grow from cold stratified seed. Once established, it fruits heavily and lives for generations. It disappeared from Western medical consideration simply because it was categorized as ornamental, and its look-alike relatives, the familiar flowering dogwoods of North American gardens, were already well known for their beauty alone. The category decided the conversation before anyone examined the chemistry. A tree that blooms in the dead of winter and delivers medicine in autumn is a tree that earns its space in every season. Number 9. The grass that is not a grass. A hidden fever herb with a mango's secret. Anamarena asphodeloides. G. mu. It grows in neat clumps of grass-like foliage and sends up tall white flower spikes that look like something from the iris family. Walk past it in a garden and you will classify it as ornamental and continue on. That is exactly what Western horticulture did and missed everything in the process. Chinese physicians use the thick rhizome of this plant for high fevers, chronic inflammatory conditions, and the blood sugar instability that, in TCM terms, map to yin deficiency and excess internal heat. It has been in documented use since the Han Dynasty and appears in Chinese medical texts across every subsequent century. Western researchers have now identified steroidal saponins in the rhizome that improve insulin sensitivity at the cellular level, a finding that Purdue University flagged in formal research as commercially significant for Western saponins. Domestic production. More unusually, the plant contains mangiferin, the same bioactive compound currently found in mango leaves and skin, under active investigation for anti-inflammatory and anti-obesity applications. Grow it in full sun to partial shade in zones 4 through 9. It tolerates a wide range of soils and handles drought well once established. Grass-like foliage reaches 1 to 2 feet, with fragrant flower spikes extending to 3 feet. It grows readily from seed and performs well in containers on balconies or patios. This plant faded from Western attention because it has no culinary application and no dramatic visual signature, two factors that determined which plants European botanical collectors chose to document and distribute in the centuries. When that selection was happening, you may be able to grow a compound that pharmaceutical researchers are currently working to isolate in a plant that looks exactly like the ornamental grasses people walk past without a second glance every single day. Number 10. One vine, 4 medicines. Trichosanthus kirilloi, Gualu. The fruit looks purely decorative, a smooth, bright orange gourd hanging from a vigorous vine across a trellis or fence. But the root, seeds, peel, and fruit of this single plant are each prescribed for entirely different conditions in Chinese medicine. No other single TCM vine operates this way. It functions as 4 separate medicines grown from one root system. Traditional physicians use the root to clear internal heat and reduce lung congestion. The seeds, to address constipation and abscess conditions. The peel for respiratory infections. And the whole fruit for what we now recognize as systemic inflammatory disease patterns. Western researchers first took serious notice during the AIDS crisis of the 1980s. A protein isolated from the root trichosanthin showed laboratory evidence of antiretroviral activity and was fast-tracked into formal clinical trials. It became one of the first TCM-derived proteins to enter the Western pharmaceutical research pipeline. Current research continues its anti-tumor investigation, with studies targeting breast and lung cancer cell lines in particular. Grow it on a strong trellis. It is vigorous and heavy when fruiting. Full sun, deep, fertile, well-draining soil, zones 7 through 11. In cooler climates, it performs well as an annual. The gourds are visually spectacular as the growing season ends. This plant's complexity made it difficult to fit into Western single-compound pharmaceutical models. When a plant's medicinal value is distributed across 4 separate parts through 4 different mechanisms, the extraction pathway becomes unclear and the industry moves on to simpler targets. 4 medicines in one vine, from one planting, in one garden bed. No supply chain in the world has matched that efficiency. Number 11. The golden thread, the tiny woodland plant, beating a major diabetes drug, Codonopsis chinensis, Huanglian. You could walk through this plant's natural woodland habitat and never register its presence. It grows under 12 inches tall, with small leaves resembling a delicate fern. Divide the rhizome and you find a network of bright golden threads, almost impossibly vivid against the dark soil that gave it its common name, and that Chinese physicians followed like a path toward treatment for 2,000 years. Those threads contain berberine, an alkaloid prescribed for serious infections, gastrointestinal illness, and blood sugar disorders throughout the Han, Tang, Song, and Ming dynasties, at a time when Western medicine had no equivalent treatment model for these conditions. Berberine has now completed enough peer-reviewed Western trials to generate serious pharmaceutical industry attention. In multiple studies targeting type 2 diabetes management, berberine demonstrated blood glucose reduction performing comparably to metformin, one of the world's most widely prescribed medications. It also carries confirmed antibacterial, antifungal, and anti-tumor activity across multiple study settings. Western pharmaceutical companies are currently attempting to synthesize it in laboratories rather than source it from the plant because the plant cannot be patented, but a synthesized analog can. Grow it in deep shade with rich, moist, acidic forest soil in zones 5 through 8. It is slow to establish and does best in shaded raised beds or true woodland gardens, growing as an understory companion beneath fruit trees or deciduous canopy. The golden rhizomes are unmistakable when you divide an established plant. This plant vanished from Western awareness for the same reason most of these plants did. It belonged to a knowledge system that the Western medical establishment spent much of the 20th century classifying as belief rather than data. The compound that modern pharmacology is racing to replicate in a laboratory is already threading gold through the soil of shaded gardens waiting for someone to grow it. Number 12. The bark behind the bloom, Magnolia officinalis, Haupo. Every gardener knows Magnolia as spectacle vast, fragrant, visually overwhelming when in flower. The blooms stop traffic, but in China, the bark was what mattered. Chinese physicians stripped and dried the bark of this specific magnolia species for 2,000 years to treat digestive cramping, anxiety, and respiratory congestion. The flowers were almost irrelevant to the medicine. Traditional physicians understood the bark to regulate movement through the digestive system, reducing bloating, calming smooth muscle spasm, and addressing the kind of persistent anxiety that manifests as tight chest and shallow breathing. These were considered related conditions in the classical framework. The compound responsible hanokiol is now among the more intensely studied molecules in Western neuroscience, specifically because it crosses the blood-brain barrier. Most plant compounds never reach the brain directly. Hanokiol does. This property is why it is appearing in Western supplement markets as a natural anxiolytic and why neuroscience researchers are actively exploring it for neuroprotective and anti-tumor applications. Grow it in full sun to partial shade in deep, rich, moist, acidic soil in zones 5 through 9. It is slow growing at the beginning and magnificent over decades. Bark can only be responsibly harvested from mature stems, making this a long-term investment rather than a quick return crop. The bark's value was invisible to Western botanical collectors who cataloged magnolias for their flowering beauty and had no reason within their existing framework to consider the bark of an ornamental tree as something worth examining further. The tree your neighbors admire for its blooms may be carrying something far more significant than any of them suspect. Number 13. The hedge that heals. Ligustrum lucidum, New Wei Zi. Most people see privet and think fence. Ligustrum lucidum, the medicinal species, is an evergreen tree with genuinely lustrous dark foliage and clusters of small black berries that Taoist physicians incorporated into seasonal immune protocols during the Han Dynasty. It was consumed specifically in winter, not as treatment, but as prevention during the months they identified as highest risk for illness. This calendar-based, preventive approach to plant medicine is now being examined by Western researchers studying seasonal immunology. Traditional physicians classified the berries as a premier tonic for the liver and kidneys, used to support longevity, eye clarity, and resistance to age-related decline. The language of classical TCM described effects that modern immunology is beginning to map to specific mechanisms. Western oncological research is documenting something specific. Ligustrum lucidum extract significantly increases white blood cell production in cancer patients undergoing chemotherapy. Multiple Chinese clinical studies have confirmed this finding, and Western researchers are beginning to follow. Its primary compounds, triterpenes and saponins, show both immune-stimulating and anti-tumor properties in current Western study settings. Grow it in full sun to partial shade in well-draining soil. Zones 7 through 11. Fast-growing, pest-resistant, and producing fruit within 3 to 4 years. In warmer climates, it naturalizes. Readily check local ecological guidelines before planting at scale, particularly in the American Southeast. This plant disappeared from medicinal consideration in the West because privet was classified as a hedge plant, and hedge plants were not medicine. The category ended the conversation before the chemistry could begin it. Something growing at the edges of suburban properties across warm climates may be carrying clinical-grade immune support inside its small black berries unrecognized and unused. Number 14. The flower root that outlasted every medical system around it. Paeonia lactiflora, Bai Xiao. This is the plant teased at the beginning, and it earned that position. The root of Paeonia lactiflora is the centerpiece of a formula called Si Wu Tang, a 4-herb compound representing the most prescribed formula in the history of classical Chinese gynecology. Its earliest comprehensive documentation appears in texts from around 800 AD. It has been in continuous clinical use since then, not referenced historically, not occasionally revived. Continuously prescribed by generation after generation of practitioners for approximately 1,300 unbroken years. That is, by most calculations, the longest unbroken clinical intervention in the history of human medicine. Traditional physicians use the root as a blood tonic, antispasmodic, and anti-inflammatory, central to treating menstrual disorders, circulatory weakness, inflammatory pain, and conditions that we now recognize as autoimmune in origin. The primary compound peoniflorin has been confirmed in Western studies to reduce systemic inflammatory markers, relax smooth muscle tissue, and modulate immune response. Western rheumatology is actively investigating it for lupus and rheumatoid arthritis protocols, not as a curiosity, as a genuine candidate treatment being considered in controlled clinical research. Grow it in full sun to light shade in rich, well-draining soil. Zones 3 through 8, it is exceptionally cold-hardy, slow to establish, but extraordinarily long-lived once rooted. Harvest roots at 4 to 5 years, when peoniflorin concentration reaches its measured peak. This knowledge faded in the West because it belonged to a system that academic medicine spent much of the 20th century classifying as cultural belief rather than clinical record. The clinical record, as it turned out, was more accurate than the dismissal. A formula that survived every century since the Tang Dynasty without modification is not surviving on faith. It is surviving because it produces results that no alternative has yet replaced. Number 15. The bone seed, when a traditional plant becomes a pharmaceutical. Soralea coryllifolia, Buguji. This is the final plant, and it belongs at the end for a reason that has nothing to do with how it grows and everything to do with what it reveals. The name translates directly as tonify bone, resinous seed. Chinese physicians used it for bone density loss. www. Vitiligo, the white depigmentation patches that appear on skin, and what classical texts called kidney yang deficiency. They documented this use for approximately 2,000 years. The seeds are small, gray-black, produced in abundance by an annual legume that reaches 2 to 4 feet, fixes nitrogen into your soil while it grows, and returns readily from self-sowing in warm climates. The compound responsible for its effects on skin depigmentation is called soralin. And here is the thing. Soralin extracted, standardized, patented, and renamed is a formally FDA-recognized compound used in a pharmaceutical treatment called PUVA therapy. Soralin plus ultraviolet light is currently prescribed by Western dermatologists for vitiligo, psoriasis, and certain lymphomas. Western medicine extracted the molecule, built a clinical protocol around it, and brought it into mainstream practice. When researchers traced soralin therapy back to its point of origin, they found it. Chinese and Indian physicians had been applying this exact compound from this exact plant for skin depigmentation disorders since at least 100 BC. The pharmaceutical intervention is the same intervention. 2,000 years later, with a new name and a patent. Grow it in full sun with well-draining to slightly dry soil, zones 8 through 11 as a reliable annual, or start indoors and move outside once temperatures hold. It self-sows freely in warm climates, fixes nitrogen while it grows, and feeds the soil for whatever you plant after it. The seeds carry the medicine. The plant improves the ground at the same time. This one plant, more than any other on this list, makes the real shape of this story visible. Western medicine does not discover traditional remedies. It confirms them. It formalizes what people who paid close attention to plants already knew and documented across centuries of observed outcomes. That is what every plant on this list has in common. The knowledge was never lost. It was simply not yet taken seriously by the institutions whose job it was to take things seriously. Across 2,000 years and 15 plants, the pattern is the same. Traditional physicians documented what worked. Modern researchers are now verifying why it worked. And the gap between those two moments was not ignorance on either side. It was institutional inertia, and it is finally beginning to close. This week, choose one plant from this list that you can realistically source from a nursery or seed supplier, just one, and look up its specific growing requirements for your climate zone. That single decision is how ancient knowledge stops being theoretical and starts becoming something rooted in your own soil. If this video gave you something genuinely new, like it so we can keep building this kind of content. Tell me in the comments which plant surprised you most, or whether you are already growing any of these and what your experience has been. And if the intersection of traditional plant knowledge and contemporary research is the content you want to find regularly in your feed, subscribe. This channel covers exactly this ground every week, without oversimplification and without gatekeeping. The plants were always there. They were waiting for the right gardener to plant them.